So this is the value that you would have gotten by using VT, which is, let's assume, undervalues the actual book value. Okay. Plus or minus in this case. Oh, plus you have minus delta plus sum t equals 1 to infinity rho times delta over 1 plus rho raised to the power t, or this part is, as you can see, that's the present value of a perpetuity that pays $1 every year. Okay, do you know how to value that? This is actually equal to 1 over rho, which means they cancel out, and these deltas cancel out. So whether I use B star T, B star 0, or B0 to begin with, doesn't matter. It gives you, theoretically speaking at least, exactly the same, what you want to call, valuation. So it is self-correcting. I'm not going to show you, but it is kind of self-correcting if earnings themselves, remember, earnings are accounting numbers, which means within regulations, without going into fraud, they can be significantly manipulated. For whatever reason, sometimes firms announce earnings that are too high. That's called earnings management. Whenever earnings are too high, that's always a matter of transferring earnings from future. So let's say you announce your earnings to be $100 billion, $100 million more than it should be. That means sometime in the future, collective earnings are going to be $100 million less. So if you have too high earnings, it's going to do two things. One, it's going to increase your book value too much. That means you're going to start paying more penalty for that. Remember, every year I'm multiplying my cost of capital with the book value. So announcing too high earnings, it's going to introduce too much penalty, which means it's going to reduce residual earnings in the future. Plus, the earnings themselves are going to be less in the future. So the method itself is self-correcting. But this is true at a theoretical level. In fact, you can show mathematically, I'm not going to. If you had infinite ability to forecast all the earnings and all the dividends in the future, it wouldn't matter what those actual earnings are, as long as any earnings management is paid up in the future. You will get exactly the same valuation. But in practice, we can estimate earnings and dividends only for a few years. Then we're going to make some sort of simplifying assumption in terms of terminal value or continuing value. In that case, it does make a difference. How much it makes a difference? Well, if you're forecasting only 1 year of earnings, it makes a lot of difference. If you're forecasting or projecting a few years where a lot of that earnings management is paid up, it doesn't make that much difference. So the only difference is going to be, is your terminal value simplification realistic enough? But that's always the problem we have with these valuation models. Same thing we had in dividend growth model. Same thing we're going to have next week when we're talking about discounted cash flow valuation. Why? Because we don't have reliable forecasts of free cash flow after a few years. And after that, we're going to assume some sort of pattern. As long as that pattern is reasonable enough, fine. In many cases, we use in practice. Basically, I look at the things, at what growth rates residual earnings or free cash flow need to grow for this current price to be justified. Let's say I find 12%. If that number is too big, the company is overvalued. If that number is too small relative to what you think they could grow, the company is undervalued. It's kind of a value judgment. But if you're valuing some sort of project, then that's different. Then you need to be able to project those earnings. Now, since it does make a difference, we're going to kind of make an adjustment to this. Your book doesn't go into this. For your own reading, if you want to, this method has been invented by a guy named Richard Feynman. When I taught Finance for 10, which is a class I created almost 15 years ago myself, financial statement analysis, I always use his textbook. He's actually an accountant. Actually, I should say accounting professor. I never call anybody I like an accountant. To me, that's a dirty word. An accounting professional, that's different. I always joke with my accounting friends. Whenever they say something, oh, it's just accounting, don't worry about it. And accounting is important because they give us the numbers that we could use in our valuations. If I can trust those numbers, then we can actually do corrections to them and come up with stuff. Now, uh, this discount rate that we use is cost of equity capital. As you know, equity generically is assets minus liabilities, right? The riskiness of the equity capital is not the same for all types of assets. We know the cost of liabilities, and we have a good way of estimating them. So we're going to take this book value, okay, or in general, we're going to decompose it into two: operating assets minus net financial obligations. For example, most cash you have is not an operating asset. And let's give you an example. Let's look at the balance sheet of, I'm going to do this quickly from financeyahoo.com. Come on. Okay. Let's look at Google. Google hasn't paid dividends since it was established. If you look at the financials, let's do quarterly balance sheets. We have it as of the end of 2024. They have $450 billion in assets. Of those, 163 are current assets. Of those, $96 billion or so are cash and short-term investments. Do you think Google needs $96 billion of cash for their operations. You need some cash for your operations because you gotta keep the place rolling. But typically, 2% of your sales is good enough for your cash requirements. You know, if we had a class in working capital management, that's roughly the number. So let's look at their sales. Trailing 12 months, $350 billion. 2% of that is only $7 billion. That means Google has essentially $90 billion in excess cash. Well, that cash is very different as an asset in terms of its riskiness compared to other assets. What are Google's biggest assets? YouTube and their search algorithm, right? They make money basically off of those. They give some other services, but it's essentially YouTube and search business. The riskiness of the search business and YouTube business is very different from riskiness of that cash. So when I'm evaluating earnings from those, it's not a good idea to discount them at the same rate. What do I earn from cash these days? 4%, 4.5%. That's about it, right? Yes, it's a low rate, but it's not risky at all. So if you think about it, divide Google into two firms, non-operating cash and operating other business.